How we sack somebody depends on the reason that we're sacking them. So in this video, I'm going to talk about the legal reasons that we can sack somebody and then how we go about doing it. Hello, my name's Jenefer. I'm the founder of Silk Helix and we help small businesses with all things HR, people management and leadership. So sacking somebody, terminating their employment, there are 5 fair reasons for doing this. And when I talk about fair, I'm talking about this in terms of the legal definition of fair. So there's 5 fair reasons for dismissing. 1 is conduct, 1 is capability, 1 is illegality, which covers things like losing a driving license when you're a driver. We have redundancy and we have some other substantial reason. So some other substantial reason I will start with, because that sounds like, well, that could just be anything and everything and we can dismiss for any reason. Sort of, but not quite. Substantial is the key word in there. It's got to be a substantial reason. If we're dismissing for SOSR, some other substantial reason, or illegality, in both of those situations we'd be expected to do some kind of consultation first to try and establish whether there are alternatives to dismissal. We always want to be looking for alternatives to dismissal, and then if that fails, if there isn't alternatives to dismissal, then we would be doing a dismissal with notice. It'll be paid notice. Redundancy also has its own process for how we dismiss people for the reason of redundancy. Which process you follow is going to depend on the number of people who are potentially going to be made redundant, and that goes into, there's quite a lot of detail there around the kind of consultations that we need to follow. The consultations become collective consultations when there are more people involved. So I'm not going to go into the full details of that in this video. I have got other videos on redundancy. The most common reasons for dismissal that we get are conduct or capability. And often people will come to me and say, can we make this person redundant? And then when we dig into it, actually, it's not a redundancy, it's a conduct or a capability issue. The key thing with redundancy is that redundancy is about the job no longer being required or in the form that it currently is. Redundancy is not about the individual, it's about the role. Whereas if it's about the individual, if it's that they're not performing, then that's going to be either a conduct or a capability issue. Under the capability umbrella, we've got ill health and we've got performance. So when we're talking capability, if we're talking ill health, we could be talking absence, so somebody who is just not capable of being at work, or it could be that due to their health, their performance is not at the level that we need it to be. Prior to dismissing somebody for that reason, we would be looking at going through a process of establishing, understanding their health, understanding whether there are alternatives, understanding whether there are reasonable adjustments we can put in place that will enable them to either come back to work or to perform at the level that we need. We would be looking at a whole range of things to try and work out whether there's any way we can be avoiding a dismissal before we get to the point of dismissing somebody because of capability regarding ill health. And it's similar if it's a performance issue. So when we're talking about capability versus conduct, conduct is won't do, capability is can't do. So if somebody is just refusing to do what you're asking them to do, that's going to be a conduct issue. If they can't do what you're asking them to do, they're trying, but they can't do it, or maybe it appears like they're not trying, that can be quite a challenging one. Actually understanding whether it's can't or won't can be quite challenging. So we need to try and establish which one it is, and often if we can't be sure, it's easier or safer to fall into the performance one. But that is going to come down to the nuances of the case and the situation that you're dealing with. So if it is a performance issue, we'd often try and deal with that informally first. So we'd be looking at having conversations with them, making sure they're clear about what the expectations are. Now that's often where people get it wrong in the first place, is not having the expectations really clear. Because when we know what the expectations are, we can then define where this person sits right now and then clearly define the gap between the two. Getting that right is going to be fundamental to being able to deal with poor performance and actually trying to reduce poor performance. So you're going to have less poor performance if you've set your objectives and your standards very clearly, because then people know what's expected of them and they're able to achieve it. I have got a course on managing performance. It's a digital course, so you could start learning right now, learn how to set those expectations, learn how to have all the conversations with people around performance, learn how to manage it, go into more detail around the process in terms of getting to a dismissal if you need to, but also getting everybody up to a better standard. So it's not just about dealing with your poor performance, but actually lifting everybody and getting your performance just spot on in your business. So there's a link on screen now, and I'll also put one in the description below. But with performance, what we'll be looking at is, once we've got that, we've set our expectations, we can see where they are, we can see what the gap is, we can define it. The first step is going to be working out how we close that gap. So do they need training? Do they need support? Do they need different resources? What do they need to be able to close that gap? And giving them the opportunity to go away and attempt to do that with the support and things that they need. If they need more training, for example, we need to go and give them that training before we're going to expect them to close that gap. We would then meet with them again, and at that point it may be, oh great, wow, everything's fixed, or we're on our way to being fixed, so we'll just review in another few weeks, for example. Or it's actually, we've put in place all these things and it's not helping and the performance still isn't there, and in which case we would be going into a formal performance management process, and in that process we're going to be going up through the levels of warning. So levels of warning will depend on your own policies, and this may well be your disciplinary policy or your capability policy. It depends, you don't have to have both, and a lot of small employers don't have both, but you may well be starting with a written warning, a final written warning, and then a dismissal. In my experience, we can often deal with things without it getting all the way to a dismissal. Sometimes it does, but if we can get it, either the performance to improve or the person to say, actually this isn't working for me, and then they go and find something that works better for them, that's a great outcome for both, and that's much better than getting to dismissal. But we do need to make sure that we've got that process so we can get to the dismissal if we need to, and that if we do get to that dismissal, it's going to be a fair dismissal. If the matter is a conduct one, then we will be following the ACAS code on disciplinary procedures. We'll be making sure that we've done a full, thorough investigation, that we understand what they are being accused of, what the allegation is, what they have or haven't done, why they have or haven't done that, what the circumstances are. The investigation is going to cover all of these things. We would then be formally inviting them to a disciplinary hearing. But that disciplinary hearing could have the outcome of a written warning, a final written warning, a dismissal. Unlikely to be a dismissal in the first instance, that tends to be building on a final written warning. Or it could be a gross misconduct matter, and this will be the only situation where we'll be dismissing without notice. And so at the point of a gross misconduct dismissal, it's going to be an instant dismissal. People often think that gross misconduct as an instant dismissal means there's no process before it, so we don't need to do all the investigation. It's just, I've seen you with your hands in the till, you're fired, get out of here. That's not going to be a fair dismissal. It needs to follow that process. You need to do the investigation, even if you've caught them with the hands in the till. And make sure that you've got an appeal right in all of these processes. So whether you're issuing a warning or a dismissal, or it's gross misconduct, give them the right of appeal. The same with a redundancy dismissal, any of these dismissals, give people the right of appeal. It allows you internally to rectify any mistakes before somebody takes it to an employment tribunal. And I have seen cases of people who have won and companies who have had to pay out at employment tribunal just because they haven't given that right of appeal. There's also another key thing to mention, and that's 2 years service. So what I've talked about here is the 5 fair reasons for dismissal. These are the only reasons that are considered to be fair. Anything else, any other reason for dismissal is going to be an unfair dismissal in the eyes of the law. Now, you need 2 years of service to bring an ordinary unfair dismissal claim. Prior to 2 years, you can bring an automatic unfair dismissal. So there's certain reasons for dismissal which are automatically unfair. One example of that would be because somebody is pregnant. That's an automatic unfair dismissal, to dismiss somebody because they are pregnant. There is a whole host of reasons for automatic unfair dismissal, but we're talking about unfair dismissal of which you need 2 years service to be able to bring that claim. And what this means is that you can often reduce the processes that you need to follow if they've got under 2 years of service. And in many small businesses, this is really important because some of these things, poor performance, for example, can have a really detrimental impact on the business. And following through lots of stages of support and getting people there, and often in a small business, you've not got the capacity to support that. So being able to deal with it in that under 2 years. The same with conduct. If you've got somebody who's just got the wrong attitude to being in your employment and is not going to follow your standards of behaviour, then you're going to want to deal with that in under 2 years. In this situation, you're not necessarily having to go through the levels of warnings. It's going to be a dismissal with notice, but you're not necessarily having to go through the warnings. You're not necessarily going to have to go through all of the procedures. You could get to that point of dismissal much more quickly. What I would say is be very careful in doing that, because if it is an automatic unfair reason, so let's say we dismiss somebody because they are not performing, and it turns out the reason that they are not performing is a disability, then potentially we've dismissed them because of their disability, and therefore that's an automatic unfair dismissal. So we do need to be cautious about the risks, and I would always recommend taking advice. There's a link to access a free advice call in the description below, so give us a call if you've got these situations. We can just give you some advice on whether or not there's risks, and if there are, what procedure you should be following. That said, I have dealt with some really complex issues here in a really short space of time, so I recommend that if you are going to dismiss somebody, you always take advice. There is details in the description below of how you can work with us to take that advice, but do make sure that you are getting this right. The costs of getting it wrong are high with an employment tribunal, and that is something you want to avoid. But also, dismissal is often a lot easier than you think it is, and if you take the right advice, you'll find that you can just follow the steps, and it is a much easier process than you're possibly thinking.